I'm Nicole Shanahan, Bobby Kennedy's running mate. Welcome to Back to the People podcast, which highlights the growth of a movement uniting America, where our government is free from corporate capture and where we give voice back to the American public.
But Pfizer didn't do that. They used the least sensitive method, and still they saw protein was being produced all over the body.
The celebration of innovation wouldn't be possible
Without free
speech.
Thank you.
These individuals were not elected by us and now are representing our interests here in our homeland.
We have had social fragmentation, individual isolation through a variety of different platforms, including the use of electronic communication, the cell phone, etc.
When you use that same methodology to test the narrative that we're being fed right now, it breaks down. That narrative breaks down. This globalist agenda actually makes no logical sense.
Brett says, you know that if we do this, your lives will never be the same.
In the United States right now, rhetoric is around far left or far right, woke versus conservative, but that's inaccurate. In your book, this wonderful book of yours that I'm working my way through called PsyWar, you say that the actual delineation is between a transhumanist agenda and a human, a kind of preserved
I think that's one of the
physical.
dialectics. Yeah, I think that's one of the dialectics. This really, for me as a native Californian, okay, born in Palo Alto in Stanford Hospital, grew up largely in the Central Coast in Goleta, north of California. So I've always kind of been an unquestioning center-left. Perhaps not so different from yourself. I don't know.
Yeah.
And coming from, I think, a similar background. I think you have a Bay Area background.
Born and raised Bay Area.
Yeah. So what I encountered was, as I was speaking out just about a common sense in bioethics in relationship to what was being done during the corona crisis, particularly with the rollout of the vaccines, but other things also. And then I got all of this weaponized hate coming at me through corporate media in particular, from people, including, I had developed relationships with established journalists over decades from big name publications, including the New York Times, and then suddenly found that none of those people would talk to me anymore. And so it became clear to me that if I was to get my message out that what was being done was wrong, ethically, in a fundamental sense, I was going to have to open up to working with the only media that was interested in hearing my message, which was the conservative media. Mm-hmm. And I was asked to come on Glenn Beck. And that was a real kind of moral dilemma for me. Do you go on Glenn Beck? That is an adjacency to Alex Jones, as I was thinking about it right then. And of course, Alex Jones was absolutely vilified. But I decided, I think as Bobby Kennedy has also said, that it's better to get your message out and not worry so much about the channel than to not be able to get your message out at all. And so I said yes to Glenn. And bizarrely, I'm told this has like never happened before. He had me on, I think it was 4 episodes in a row. And at the end of it, he said to me, Robert, what I've really enjoyed about this is that politics hasn't come into it. We've just been discussing current trends and the infectious disease issues, et cetera, and the management or mismanagement of the COVID crisis, and I've really enjoyed that. And that was the moment in which I kind of had a mental realignment, and I realized that the whole way that I'd been structuring the world as a right versus left dialectic was no longer valid, and that instead, as my original construction was that this was about collectivism versus individualism and individual liberty. And then as I've kind of progressed over time, I've realized that there's a number of different kind of axes going on here, like the one
Yes.
that you mentioned, and that the old framing of left versus right, or you called it far left versus far right. I rarely hear anybody say far left. It's always just far right, which my experience, having spent a lot of time dealing with the Europeans right now, in the European politics, is that really what they are is center right. They're center right, and they are, um,
When you recalibrate for historical context,
yeah,
they really are center right.
yeah, center right
Hmm.
populist movements.
Hmm.
And I was just listening to a fantastic interview, the channel Unheard. I don't know if you're familiar with Unheard. It's a British publication, and it had a British analyst named Neil Ferguson on, talking about what's really going on here in the
Yeah.
dynamics. The world is turning around, and I don't know where it goes from here.
Robert, you were asked by several people to comment on the mRNA vaccine because
Mhm.
you're deeply familiar with it.
Incessantly, right?
I mean, that's typically why people want to connect with you because they're trying to
Initially,
understand.
yeah,
Initially,
yeah.
now it's evolved because as you've personally experienced your transformation and the public manipulation around who you are as a bioethicist, as somebody who has spent years understanding um, disease management and disease control.
And also the government and government contracting and a lot of things. Yeah, I've now find myself at the tip of a lot of new topic areas, including globalism.
Well, for
And
people not familiar with you, I have a young audience,
Mhm.
millennials and Gen Xers.
Okay,
How would you describe yourself and your relationship with epidemiology and the mRNA vaccine?
I've pretty much spent, it's now about 40 years of my life, uh, um, pursuing a career in biotechnology, genetic engineering, starting off focusing on gene therapy at the Salk Institute in UC San Diego, MD at Northwestern, master's at UC San Diego, bachelor's in biochemistry at UC Davis. So very much a Californian that then went to Chicago for his medical training, uh, and very much involved in virology. And because of just a set of circumstances early on as an undergraduate. I was originally a computer science student, by the way, for the first 2 years, uh, and then decided I didn't want to spend the rest of my life staring at a monitor in a basement. And so I went into medicine, and then found myself staring at a monitor in a basement, but making half the same salary that I would have made if I'd stayed.
Right.
So I was committed to this new technological space of uh, molecular biology and genetic engineering, and passionately wanted to be involved in the application of gene therapy technology to treat inborn errors of metabolism in children. I
Hmm.
wanted to be a pediatrician gene therapist,
Hmm.
because I was coming at UC Davis out of a laboratory that was at the front edge of retrovirology. And one of my mentors was very involved in the very earliest days of AIDS. And so I got to see the good, the bad, and the ugly of all of those politics and the science behind it. And so for my graduate work, I went to one of the top gene therapy programs in the world, which is at the Salk Institute in La Jolla. And they're uh, pursuing questions about how RNA gets packaged into retroviruses, deep technical stuff, and trying to do it using modern technology. I found myself having solved a set of problems that involved manufacturing of RNA at large scale, purification, uh, and then finally the ability to deliver it into cells, because I wanted to ask fundamental questions about how that RNA got packaged into retroviruses. Nobody had ever done any of this stuff. And then having done that, uh, realized that inadvertently I had um, backed into having discovered a whole new non-viral gene delivery, gene therapy platform. And then the question was, with a highly labile, so RNA is not stable. Regular mRNA only lasts in your body for a short period of time in your cells after it's made. And so the question was, well, what good is it going to be for anything? And having a background in vaccinology from my time at UC Davis and AIDS and all that, and also at Northwestern with influenza viruses and Bob Lamb, I realized that this could be used for vaccination purposes. And so I filed those patent disclosures at the Salk Institute.
What year was that?
That was about 1989.
Wow.
So I was 28. Then all hell broke loose. People thought it was a major breakthrough, that there was a lot of money to be made. And when that happens,
Because
and
it changes the way we
think about it.
manufacture
Well,
and
and
think
the
about
way
vaccines entirely.
it's so the core, it opens up a whole new pharmaceutical space. Messenger RNA as a pharmaceutical was a radical idea. Matter of fact, the Salk dropped the patent application because they thought it could never be practical. Likewise, the company that I went to after I had my nervous breakdown when I got caught in all the crossfire over this, called Vical, and that was where it was reduced to practice. We showed that you can generate an immune response against influenza and AIDS antigens. You can get protection in a mouse model from influenza. This is all 1990, 1991. They thought that RNA would never be practical. So did Merck, who was their partner at the time. And so they only focused on the DNA, and they burned through a couple of $1 billion and never got anything out of it. And then the patents expired, and then suddenly DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, decided that there was something to this and started pushing money in. So did In-Q-Tel. I think you're probably well familiar with In-Q-Tel.
I'm familiar with In-Q-Tel and its massive patent portfolio.
Right, who's very much aligned with CIA. Generally put, decided to capitalize this and push money into development of mRNA for drug and vaccine purposes, and that's what launched Moderna and got this whole ball rolling. That all happened after the patents had expired, and in the interim, about a decade after I had done my work, along comes this Katie Carrico and Drew Weissman at UPenn, and they came up with the idea of using pseudo urine, which is a modified chemical, and they actually use a modified pseudo urine that's non-natural that they put into the RNA that makes it extremely stable, so it loses that benefit. But I'm way down in the science weeds. So in terms of...
No, I think people are really fascinated because they've heard snippets. They've heard that mRNA has been around. It's been tested. There's been many mouse models. There's been lots of interest in it over decades,
is propaganda. It's really an overselling of what was done previously. And one thing I want to mention that a lot of people get kind of crossed up over, mRNA is a fundamental biomolecule. It's part of all of our bodies. It's part of all of our cells. It shouldn't be anything mysterious. It's just an acronym that stands for messenger ribonucleic acid, which is related to DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, but it's single-stranded. I like to use, when talking to people that haven't been in the world of molecular virology, the metaphor, and it's outdated, a ticker tape. You remember ticker tapes? It's technology that was used to transmit information on Wall Street about whatever was happening. So RNA is kind of like a ticker tape. It just gets read out by a little, you could think of it as a nanobot, a biologic nanobot called the ribosome that makes proteins. And so it just gets threaded into this protein RNA complex, and that becomes the signal or the code. It's a 4-base code as opposed to binary, since you're a digital person, that gets read off in 3 bases at a time. So the reading frame is 3. Encodes for proteins. That's all it is. And so that's just to demystify, what is RNA. And no, I didn't invent RNA and all that stuff.
Right. But what you did discover is that the way that you can edit mRNA for specific purposes.
You can manufacture it to make anything you want, any protein.
Any protein, and then that protein
If you,
interacts with cells.
or it's made by the cells. That what the tech does is it makes it so that your cells become the manufacturing facility.
Mm-hmm.
And from the standpoint of government and that blob and the people that are pursuing these things and trying to capitalize them, and pharma, the thing that is revolutionary about this, a couple of them. One is that it's the same manufacturing process. People don't appreciate how important manufacturing process is in biologics. It makes or breaks a product.
Mm-hmm.
And it's typically with, say, a monoclonal antibody or a protein therapeutic, it's an extensive development, optimization, testing, purification process for each single product. So that adds a ton of money and time. With the mRNA tech, you essentially have the parallels to the digital world are pretty good. You have a core tech platform,
Mm-hmm.
and all you have to do is go in computationally and direct a machine that you want it to produce this RNA versus that RNA.
Mm-hmm.
And you can create the templates, typically DNA templates, and then you make the RNA from that, to manufacture pretty much whatever you want. And so the manufacturing and purification process is more or less universal. So you could just swap out this sequence for that sequence. You basically send a purchase order off to China, and they send you back your DNA. That's essentially how it works.
Mm-hmm.
And then
It
you
becomes very
incorporate
modular.
it very modular.
It becomes very modular. It's one standard structure, and then the one piece you just swap out is that specific disease
sequence.
that you're the sequence that you're trying
to make whatever it is that you think you want to make.
Create the antibodies for it.
Or you can actually use it to manufacture antibodies, or you can use it to manufacture antigens. That's the vaccine tech, which will then provoke your body to make antibodies and cellular immune responses. So the idea for the vaccine space is the metaphor that is most helpful is that of live attenuated viral vaccines.
Mm-hmm.
So if you go get your yellow fever vaccine, for example, what you will be getting is a modified yellow fever virus. An attenuated, that means that it's weakened a little bit. But by the way, if you take multiple yellow fever vaccines, you can die of yellow fever. It's a dose thing. So that's the attenuation. Instead, when in that case, you're infected with a modified yellow fever virus, or flu mist is the flu vaccine that you take in the nose, that makes your cells make the protein, the virus proteins. Okay, so that's very similar in a lot of ways. Only when you do that, viruses have a lot of tricks that shut down and manipulate immune systems and drive them this way or that way to the benefit of the virus.
Well, and especially in children who have a developing immune system, and sometimes they don't know the difference between their own cells. And
well, the autoimmune problem is, you're right, is a problem in children, but it's a problem in all of us, really. So good catch on that. Yes. But just to try to stay back on the simple part, instead of a modified virus that is introducing its genetic information into your cells and then you're making virus proteins, that's a live attenuated vaccine. In this case, you're introducing a little sequence component of the virus without the rest of the virus, and causing your cells to manufacture the protein that'll generate an immune response, blah, blah, blah. So it's similar but different, and the devil is in the details, because it turns out that things like the pseudo uridine modification, the lipid nanoplexes, the cationic lipid components, each of those have their own toxicity.
Yes, and let's talk about the pseudo-uridine, because that was a big breakthrough.
Pseudo-uridine. Okay.
Pseudo-uridine. It is a chemical that helps preserve the lifespan of the mRNA during injection.
So that functionally, that's one of the things that happens. That's not why Carrico and Weissman added it. So what is, let's start off really quick. What is pseudo-uridine? RNA is made of 4 bases for components A, U, G, C. One of those is uridine or uracil. So that's the U. So it's A, U, G, C. And that molecule in your body naturally gets modified by a protein sometimes as a way to modulate how that RNA works in a variety of different ways. It can change your immune response, in often suppresses immune responses. It changes how the RNA folds. This RNA folds back on itself and forms little helices and loops. It can affect things like there's kind of a stuttering phenomena that happens with protein translation with the ribosomes, which can lead to production of proteins that are not what was really intended. Okay, this is called frame shifting. So it suppresses immune responses, which is the reason why Carrico and Weissman used it, is because they knew that one of the problems that I had encountered, they knew that because they talked to me, and was known in the field at that time. One of the problems was the immune response against foreign RNAs. And so they introduced it, and when they did so, the science of pseudouridine, understanding of pseudouridine, was very, very early. And one of the first things that was learned about it was that if you put it into a synthetic RNA, then that synthetic RNA would be less immunogenic. So they said, this is our big discovery, is we'll take this, put it into there, and then it will solve this problem. Now, what they didn't recognize is that one of the other effects of pseudouridine is that it makes RNAs last longer. In your body, it's involved in regulation of RNA turnover. And so from their standpoint, another beneficial effect of making the whole thing work better. But what is never done in your body is to substitute all of the U's for this pseudouridine. And then what pharma learned after Carrico and Weissman's discovery was that you could make another synthetic pseudouridine that was even more powerful.
Wow.
And so that's the one that's actually in the RNAs, quote unquote, or many people call, I think even the FDA refers to them as pseudo RNA. Then that's what is in these products.
You very famously came forward and said that this technology was not ready for
prime
human
time. Yeah.
consumption.
Yeah.
And you really rang the alarm bell, and you tried to reach many news outlets for which you had contacts, really big platforms like New York Times, and I assume WAPO, Washington Post, and others, and
Vanity Fair,
and all of our favorites. And
my world is so much different from it was then. Yeah,
mine too.
Yeah.
You really tried to reach out and tried to inform the public through these news channels, and you were turned away.
Yeah, and more than that, there was a real active campaign to sell Carrico and Weissman for the Nobel Prize. And so I was up against that, and I'm still not sure who was behind that. Probably UPenn and Pfizer were big. Often with Nobel these days, there's a marketing campaign. I had a friend at the Karolinska that I had gone to visit years ago, who's now a full professor and works in RNA delivery and RNA vaccines. And I called him and said, what should I do about this that's going on? Because I'm basically being gaslit and railroaded. And he said, "Oh, don't worry about it. The committee's already met. They know what you did, and don't worry about it." And they're not impressed by these kind of. Well, we know. Fast forward 2 years, and they got the Nobel. But so I was up against this kind of marketing juggernaut, and also now what's documented, and we talk about it in the book, unbeknownst to me, is that I had absolutely, I think being calling it a blacklist is reasonable. The Jura ticket system, et cetera, that's part of this censorship industrial complex. And I was identified as misrepresenting my credentials. I think they called it so-called inventor of RNA, despite all the patents. When they wrote the various attack articles, notoriously Atlantic Monthly and all the others, they never cited the patents. They never even looked at them. We actually had an interview from the author for the New York Times came to our farm and interviewed us, and she refused to look at the patents.
Wow. Well, because if she looked at it, she'd have to write about it.
So
It's the same
yeah,
thing with taking a quote. Oftentimes, when you send a quote to these outlets, they recommend you keep it short so that they have to
yeah,
fully publish that
yeah,
full sentence,
yeah,
that one or two sentences
yeah,
that you
yeah.
give them.
That's so many things to learn about modern press
Mm-hmm.
that it's been a steep learning curve for me. So it was clear to me that something wasn't right. And as somebody who has been at the tip of the spear in multiple outbreaks before, uh, I'd never seen anything like this before in my life, professional life or otherwise, in terms of the censorship propaganda. And
Could you have predicted then some of the issues we're seeing now with myocarditis, reproductive challenges in women, irregular menstruation? Nature just published an article on the impact on ovarian granulosa cells
which you
of the
tweeted out
vaccinated.
to your credit.
I did. And well, this is an area that I'm fairly familiar with through my work in women's reproductive science is granulosa cells, which are so foundational to reproductive health. And so to have granulosa cells impacted is really it's so foundational to ovarian function.
Yeah. So you asked, could I have predicted? The answer is to some extent, yes. Not the myocarditis, but I knew very early on about the myocarditis. I was in close contact, weekly Zoom calls with three key leaders at the FDA that were in the office of the director or the office of the chief scientist. Very, very senior people. Uh, and we were having regular telecons, basically comparing notes. And so they had worked with a leading biostatistician from a big Silicon Valley data firm that had, with them, they had analyzed early adverse event data on the jabs and had detected a number of signals, including the myocarditis signal, as well as reactivation of latent DNA viruses, so shingles, among others. And some other signals. And that was denied by the FDA. And then they tried to contact the CDC, and the CDC denied it. And then somehow they contacted the folks involved in the data being gathered in Israel, and they confirmed it. And then the Israeli database people were communicating with the CDC people, and they were communicating with the FDA people, and then it kind of fed back that in fact the myocarditis was a risk. But my original beef with all this, and I think I might have been the first or one of the first, was about the bioethics. To me, it was just clear that there was a failure to provide informed consent. And all of this coercion, enticement, etc., was fundamentally illegal in terms of the bioethics that I've been trained on. So that's what I spoke out about. And then people started asking me these questions about the vaccine technology and what is mRNA and issues about the immune responses being generated. And so then I started basically trying to educate people. And then along came this um, Canadian vaccinologist, academic vaccinologist named Byron Bridle, who had somehow obtained from the Japanese regulatory authority an early copy of they'd put it on their website, an early copy of the Pfizer Common Technical Document Submission to Japan. That's regulatory language. This is the dossier that says, this is all we know about this vaccine. Please let us start marketing it or give us emergency use authorization, is basically what that is. And Byram had obtained this and reviewed it. And most of it's in Japanese, but the tables were in English. And he was shocked. and he wrote an essay and submitted it to the little insider trade journal that I had published my first piece on the bioethics, named Trial Site News. And Trial Site News they were trusting me, but who is this guy, Byron Bridle? I don't know. And so they said, well, we're going to have to run this through by Dr. Malone. Now, I know Byron well these days, and he tells the story that he was really intimidated, that he thought that this fearsome Dr. Malone was just going to shred him. And instead, I read the same documents he had read and came to the same conclusions. And furthermore, I took it to some of my regulatory colleagues that are more senior than I in regulatory affairs and said, no, this is what I'm seeing. Do you see the same things? And they said basically, yeah, and there's these other ones that you missed. Okay?
Wow. So they had more evidence.
So those documents demonstrated a number of things about the non-clinical data package, that's to say the animal studies, that I just couldn't square the circle of this being allowed to proceed into humans and those data. And one of those was the distribution of these products and their predilection to bind to ovarian tissue, more than testicular tissue, strangely, and that may have to do with the charge phenomena. And so it was immediately apparent that there were reproductive risks.
Wow.
And this is very, very early on. So I wrote my essay, Byron wrote his essay, and I, having read this and read what Pfizer had submitted, that is largely built on the tech that I had done decades before and was an expert in, including, this is something that there are those who just go crazy over this, the use of luciferase, which is the firefly protein that makes the firefly tail glow. So that's what luciferase is it's just the protein, and I happen to have been in the laboratory that pioneered the use of this protein as a reporter gene at UC San Diego. And so I was well aware of it, and so I started using it in my animal studies as well as to develop the platform tech. And so was well familiar with the strengths and weaknesses and et cetera. And what I saw was that Pfizer was using the least sensitive method to detect luciferase protein expression in the mouse models and that it was using, which is whole body imaging rather than dissecting out the organs and grinding them up and seeing how much of this protein was in there.
Because it glows, and the point of using it is that you can see...
Yeah, it produces photons.
It produces photons in the body, so you can see the impact on the living organism.
You can see exactly where it goes and produces protein, very precisely, with amazing sensitivity and linearity. This is getting technical, but that's the beauty of luciferase. But, and I was one of the ones that pioneered this, you can also deliver luciferase DNA or RNA into an animal like a mouse and inject the firefly substrate called luciferin that the enzyme acts on to produce photons of light, and take the animal anesthetized and put it into a light box, a dark box with a photomultiplier tube camera, and image the whole animal.
Right.
But that is really insensitive. It's kind of a parlor trick. It looks really cool. The mouse glows. What's not to like? But
important for testing and understanding the functions
but it's like I said, it's a little bit of a parlor trick, because what happens is the photons, as they're coming out of those tissues, bounce around. They encounter the skin and the bone and everything else. And so what you get is the least sensitive way to detect luciferase and its distribution. The right way to do it is you dissect the animal after you sacrifice it, and you analyze each of the organs, and then you get real numbers in terms of how much protein is being made. But Pfizer didn't do that. They used the least sensitive method, and still they saw protein was being produced all over the body. And you may just reel back, okay, in time. The accepted narrative was that you inject it into your shoulder, into the deltoid, and it stays there. And it goes at most to the draining lymph nodes, your axillary lymph nodes, and provokes an immune response. But it doesn't go all over your body. They insisted on that. When I said otherwise, based on the Pfizer data, I was, once again labeled as a crank, as a spreader of misinformation. But in fact, that's what Pfizer's own data showed in using the least sensitive method. The point is that when I saw all this, I thought to myself, I can't understand, because I still believe the FDA was acting with integrity.
Mm-hmm.
And so my conclusion was Pfizer must have pulled the wool over their eyes. They don't really have experts in this technology. They don't really know what's going on. And so they've been misled. And so all I need to do, naively, is call up Peter Marks, head of CBER, Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, in charge of the group that is regulating the vaccines, including Marion Gruber and the others that were fired or resigned,
Mm-hmm.
And have a discussion with him and offer my services. I did a lot of contracting work with the federal government. I understand the federal government. I was working a lot with the DoD at the time. And I would be glad to volunteer my time to help my colleagues at the FDA better understand what Pfizer was showing them and the meaning of those things. So I called him up, and we arranged for a Zoom call. There's actually a press person from the FDA on the call in addition, and we have a chat. And he basically says, paraphrasing, Robert, I have new data now, and I've reviewed it, and there's nothing in that data that causes me any concerns. And I would really appreciate it if you wouldn't make a big deal out of this. Again, I'm paraphrasing, because I want to be able to introduce it to the public in my own time, in my own way. And so out of professional courtesy, I say, okay. Now, it turns out that those data that he's referring to were the data that the FDA tried so hard to keep from releasing, and they had to be forced into court by Del Bigtree's group, as you'll recall.
I remember that. And when it was eventually released, it was
Stunning.
almost entirely, well, a lot of it was redacted as well.
Well, true. Fair enough. But still a huge volume of information, which contradicted the position that Peter was taking, that it was all on the up and up and safe and effective. So that's kind of, that for me was a turning point. And right about that time, I got this call from this interesting Silicon Valley entrepreneur that apparently had invented the optical mouse, named Steve Kirsch. And he says, Robert, he had been asking me to help him.
He's even more canceled in Silicon Valley than I am at this point.
Yeah. Steve is, I've known Steve a lot now. And he's a brother, but like brothers, we have our disagreements from time to time. So I've been helping him, trying to negotiate the world of the FDA and BARDA relating to some sponsored research that he had done with a early treatment option through Washington University in St. Louis. And he calls me up and he says, Robert, I want you to go on this podcast, this Dark Horse podcast. With this
Tony
guy,
Lyons.
with Brett Weinstein.
Oh, Brett Weinstein.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I thought Dark Horse podcast, that sounds like the dark web. That's pretty scary. I've never been on a podcast before, but what the hell? I'm in this whole new world. And so I jumped on a plane, flew out to Portland, and went into the studio in his home, and Brett's home. And we all met, like I said, 3 old men sitting around a table for 2 hours, and it goes viral, is when you know that something weird is going on. We all met, and Brett says, you know that if we do this, your lives will never be the same. And there is going to be a black backlash.
Yeah.
And he was absolutely right.
Yeah.
He got demonetized. Interestingly, not because of what we said about the jab, but because of what he said about ivermectin.
Interesting.
And Steve eventually had to resign from his company. Brett predicted that if I did this, I would never get the Nobel Prize, which I knew was long shot anyhow, so I thought that wasn't that much of a risk.
You're
And
worthy of a better prize, honestly, seeing
well,
how that's been
so
co-opted.
so in any case, uh, we kind of had foreshadowing that that was going to be a big event, and it was.
Mhm.
It went to millions, and the thing that's relevant to the thread that you started this with, talking about the reproductive harms, is that um, we finished the podcast, which was live, and then suddenly the cell phones just started blowing up, and the ticker on the views was just spinning, and we started on the trip back to the airport. We started getting phone calls, largely from women, complaining about the reproductive harms that they'd experienced because we talked about the data from the Pfizer data package.
Mhm.
And it was heartbreaking. I had not encountered that. I had some peripheral awareness that this was a concern and that these basically support groups that had self-assembled on Facebook, et cetera, were starting to get censored. Uh, but the stories that came out were heartbreaking. Um, the miscarriages, the dysmenorrhea, the endometriorrhagia, the bleeding, unusual
Mhm.
bleeding, postmenopausal women starting to have menses again. All of these are really bad signs for anybody schooled in pathology, which is what my medical special. I taught pathology at medical schools for about a decade.
Mhm.
Um, and when you hear this kind of information, you know that there's bad stuff going on.
Yeah.
And yet these women, I called it the ultimate gaslighting. I mean, can you imagine?
Well, the doctors weren't collecting this information as an
Oh, it was
adverse,
worse than not collecting. They were denying it,
right?
actively denying it.
Mhm. My own OB had commented to me how in 1 week she had performed more DNCs and had no live births for one of the first times in her almost 20-year career. That there were these women coming in with miscarriages. They needed to go through a procedure, and she was just seeing statistically things not being weighted properly. But never did she think to connect it to the mRNA vaccine. What is causing this cognitive dissonance in so many qualified professionals?
That's $1 million question. Um,
And I know this goes to the heart of your book because the heart of your book lays out these preconditions in our psychology that lead to where we are today, which is a huge portion of the population blindly trusting the propaganda that we're seeing being produced by the media, blindly accepting um, that anyone who is a dissident against the common narrative is a conspiracy theorist and dangerous. But there's
yeah.
preconditions that lead to this moment that we're in history.
So the book kind of starts um, uh, in the middle of my journey of trying to comprehend what's going on. The preceding book, Lies My Government Told Me and the Better Future Coming. And then preceding that, the kind of breakthrough moment was when I started talking about the work of Matthias Desmet, Dr. Matthias Desmet from Belgium, relating to mass formation, or it was originally posted as mass formation psychosis.
Mhm.
And um, I started lecturing on that, and because no one had ever heard of it in the States. And what I found was, as I was going to these meetings, often in megachurches, was this heartbreak of people, often professionals, with other professional family members or firefighters or whatever, that were encountering this you say cognitive dissonance, this tension. Just for the audience, what is cognitive dissonance? It's perhaps the deepest form of psychological pain in which you're holding two contradicting thoughts at the same
Two
time in your brain.
contradicting truths.
Yeah.
The truth that you have experienced through lived experience, and then the truth that is being dictated to you.
That's one form of it. Yeah, for
Mhm.
sure. And so um the people were experiencing this cognitive dissonance, well put, of having friends and family rejecting them because they were speaking about truths that they were encountering, often as first responders or others, that were inconsistent with the approved narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And this was tearing families apart. And that also was causing deep psychological pain for many people that were experiencing this as shunned individuals that had previously been part of a social group like a family or a professional organization, et cetera. And so what I'd found was that when I spoke about Matthias's theories which are based on the work of Hannah Arendt, a prominent Jewish intellectual who was a Holocaust survivor during World War II, that originally spoke about totalitarianism. And that's based on other historic thinkers, including Sigmund Freud, going back all the way to Plato. And Plato's allegory of the cave is really about this same phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
And when I would speak about it, I would see grown men crying in relief from having an explanation for this previously inexplicable phenomena of being rejected and gaslit and shunned. And I knew there was something deep and powerful that was healing about this. And so it was coming from that standpoint of, whether or not this is right. I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but I'm seeing that it is really healing for people. And so therefore it's worth sharing. And so then the notorious Joe Rogan hit,
Mm-hmm.
In which Joe asked me about this. And I just laid out Matthias's theory that we have had social fragmentation, individual isolation through a variety of different platforms, including the use of electronic communication, the cell phone, et cetera, and the rise of bullshit jobs and all these things that has fragmented our society and torn us apart, and the need for human beings to come together, and that when this happens, sometimes they will nucleate around a leader or an idea. And that this is often gives rise to totalitarian movements.
Well, that's what I found so fascinating when I was reading your book. It was from the perspective of a political theorist. Your entire book, there's hundreds of pages here, and it's all on political discourse and political theory. So you had this rebirth professionally. You spent the dominant part of your career
As a molecular virologist,
as a
immunologist.
molecular virologist who has developed breakthrough technologies in the lab and have trusted this system to bring scientists together for open and free discourse in the United States, which is a country protected by the greatest document ever created, the Constitution, which allows specifically for scientists to provide dissident voices.
Yes, well put.
And here you are.
Maybe that is a key engine behind the innovation and economic miracles we've experienced within the American culture.
Oh, 100%. Human innovation would not be possible. The celebration of innovation wouldn't be possible without free speech.
Thank you.
It is, I mean, look at how radical. I've spent my career looking at the patent corpus. I created an AI to look at how human innovation has leapt so precipitously over the course of American innovation, and that is
okay. So you understand the
due.
structure of scientific revolutions.
Of course, I've seen the leap statistically.
That book just changed my world.
Mm-hmm. And so here you are, one of the greatest scientists in our country, having a personal rebirth because you get called out as a dissident, and you are then revoked of First Amendment freedoms, and the entire book of your work gets immediately discredited, seemingly over a span of a few months.
Yeah.
I mean, this must have been...
Wikipedia was an eye-opener.
Tell me about that. What happened with Wikipedia? I'm not familiar with that story.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. So Jill, actually, I haven't said this before on a podcast. Jill, as all this is breaking, my wife and partner, by the way, that's a key part of the story. You talk about me, but what you're missing in that is my wife of 45 plus years and partner, high school sweethearts,
Oh, wow.
Dr. Jill Glasspool Malone, was trained in biological anthropology. And so this is primatology, et cetera, as well as in public policy and immunology, is where she got her PhD. And so we've always had this active dialogue every morning over coffee, et cetera, about the nature of the world and the politics that are going on, et cetera. And so that's a lot of those epiphanies and insights really come from vicarious understanding of the social sciences consequent to my marriage. But in this journey, what I realized was that as I came to understand the mass formation ideas, the underlying and trying to make sense, I like to say one of my go-to defense mechanisms. When you get attacked like this, I'm sure you're now experiencing it. I mean, it's fascinating to look at what you're experiencing right now, because all of the same methods and even the same publications are raking you over the coals exactly the way that they did to me. And so I look at that with a little bit of empathy and also sadness for you. But my response was an intellectual one of trying to say, what's going on here? How do I understand this? How do I make sense of what I'm experiencing?
Well, I think this is a really good segue into what is happening here, because you lay it out really beautifully in your book around chapter 28. You talk about this global movement to reframe a fourth industrial revolution around the integration of advancements in technology, a lot of it nanotechnology, with the human experience. So fundamentally evolving the human experience.
This is the virtuals, physicals, machines and overlords chapter, I think, that you're talking about.
Well, you get to that chapter, but you build it up with a outline of the UN really holding itself up as this futuristic organization of elites.
Yeah, it's the new. It has the United Nations has transformed itself from its original charter, which was basically to maintain peace between independent Westphalian. It's the Westphalian system of independent nation states that, by agreement, this goes back to the Treaty of Westphalia in Germany in the 1600s, that it's the foundation for why we are an independent nation state. And one of the fundamental agreements there is that independent nation states will not intervene in each other's internal affairs. And the belief system of the globalists, this new movement, that the World Economic Forum happens to be one of the key champions of, is that we're now facing global existential crises, including climate, which cannot be readily resolved by independent Westphalian nation states. And so we need to have some governmental structure that is above the nation state. And then that is now couched in the logic of stakeholder capitalism, which is something that Klaus Schwab didn't invent, but he's been a major champion of, now retiring head of the World Economic Forum and a protege of Henry Kissinger's, has championed this idea of stakeholder capitalism, that companies have broader social responsibilities. That's the simplest way, and I think we can all agree on that. There's a broader social context, but then we get into the nitty-gritty. And the thesis has been that the old independent nation state model is not adequate to address modern global crises and challenges, and so we need to have something bigger. And that something bigger then extends to, well, who's going to drive the bus? And the WEF, World Economic Forum, has which is, we assert, essentially a trade organization representing, depending on how you want to slice it, the 100 largest or the 1,000 largest transnational corporations in the world. And of course, it's intrinsically corporatist. which we have long championed, that the true name for corporatism is fascism, if you go back to Benito Mussolini, and that the whole construction and propaganda around and weaponization of the term fascism is a perversion. That fascism originally related to corporatism and the partnership between the state and corporations. And so that's the business model now for this new globalist structure, embodied in particular
and it's fundamentally anti-capitalist at its heart, because
in a weird way,
free market capitalism separates functions of government from the private sector.
I'm a big fan of Murray Rothbard, which is the Austrian School of Economics, and which conveniently is also at the core of Javier Milei's logic down in Argentina, which I think is one of the most interesting areas intellectually in the world right now, is the idea of the bad terminology. They call it anarcho-capitalism, but the Austrian School of Economics theory is about free market.
Well, when you think about who's controlling, and you write about this in your book, who's controlling certain search results on Google, it's not being dictated.
Something you know a little bit about.
Yeah. It's certainly, we've come a long way from the way Google was once structured, which was a series of these backlinks of web pages linking to one another based on an algorithm showing where users are paying most attention. And now you have a whole section in your book showing us that there are very specific search results that are being dictated by the UN, specifically around information and scientific discussion on climate change.
Among others. So getting back, you're right, pulling me back to the thread. So the WEF and the UN have both kind of strategically positioned themselves. And remember, the World Health Organization is a branch of the United Nations, have strategically positioned themselves as the logical world government. I don't know how else to say it. As opposed to a guarantor of world peace actively intending to promote peace between independent nation states. They've now structured themselves under a socialist leader, formerly from Portugal, that well entrenched socialist, believes in all of that logic. That we have to have, it gets back to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and all of this got embodied in a time when most of us weren't paying attention, including the United States Senate. In a treaty signed, it's recognized as an international treaty, although it wasn't positioned as a treaty in the United States, signed by President Obama right as he was leaving office, which is called Agenda 2030. And Agenda 2030 basically lays out the globalist agenda in the form of a treaty, and the United States is a signatory to that now. Technically, this is the way the courts have interpreted that. That could be challenged, and I've spoken to legal scholars about this, but that's the way it's structured right now, is that it has the force of a treaty, and it's the document that, among other things, lays out that human beings have the right to basically live wherever they want. So that is the legal underpinnings for the open border policies.
Yeah, because we're seeing this across so many countries all at the same time, these common agendas. And it's not by coincidence.
Yeah, absolutely not. And the propaganda is harmonized. That was, for me, you have these little epiphanies as you're going along, and if you're out in the, been forced into the forefront of these things, like has happened with me in this, and Jill and myself, and because we were asked to travel so much to speak during the COVID crisis, we got to see a lot of different cultures, particularly in Europe and the United States, and notice the parallels, like the harmonized simultaneous messaging, down to the level, remember Bobby Kennedy was one of the Dirty Dozen. We traveled to Italy and gave very early on participated in a important conference in the Senate in Rome. Talk about a bucket list. If you get invited to speak at the Senate of Rome, what are you going to do? Of course you'd say yes. So, and we went there and were attacked by the Italian press as the Dirty Dozen, misinformation spreaders, the same language that was deployed here in the United States against Bobby and others, Mercola,
Wow.
was deployed in the mainstream corporate press in Italy, but they only identified 10 of us. So apparently 10 is a dozen in Italy. But that and the harmonized purchasing of influencers
Mm-hmm.
all across the Western world, we this really kind of came to a head when we traveled to Vienna.
Mm-hmm.
Vienna has this very active music and arts community, very deep, centuries old. And we were invited to speak to a dissident community in Vienna. And one of the things we learned was the same exact thing had happened there, but they had bought off the musicians.
Wow.
This harmonized purchasing of influencers, comedians. Of course, you remember all the wonderful clips
Mm-hmm.
of what happened on late night television, etc.
Yeah.
This was all purchased and it was all harmonized. And these policies were all harmonized, which led me to eventually, you're familiar with my friend Gavin DeBecker,
Mm-hmm.
author of Gift of Fear, somebody that is very involved in providing security to people like, including Mr. Kennedy, and happens to employ a former director of the CIA. And I asked Gavin at one point, do you think this could have been the CIA pulling this off? Is this, I can't imagine, I'm not aware of any organization that has the organizational capabilities to do a lift like this harmonized, global, simultaneous propaganda. Gavin spoke to his employee about this, who said, and Gavin asked him the question, is the CIA currently the most powerful organization in the world? And the answer came back after some thought, yes, I think it is. And this is another major theme in the book, is the power that has been amassed. Some people call it the blob
Mm-hmm.
in the United States government, as something even transcending the deep state or the administrative state. This kind of core intelligence, State Department, DoD capability that exists.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as I've traveled through time and space, in intellectual space and operationally through the COVID crisis, every single major event, as I go down those rabbit holes and try to make sense of things, I find the intelligence community looking back at me at one point or another.
And we don't really know who these people are exactly or what their motivation is, but we can see who their actors are on the periphery. And who their actors are on the periphery believe that there is a need to get past independence. That independence of countries and independence of communities and independence of
It's counterproductive in the modern world.
is counterproductive, and that private ownership and pure free speech is dangerous.
Yep.
And that humans are dangerous if left to their own devices.
Well put.
I think this is really important because we have to get at the heart of the issue, because I see many, many complacent minds out there that are buying into this global agenda, that believe deeply such great progress has been made and that we must continue on course with this global. There's a lot of people out there. I had someone tell me the other day that I think censorship of the internet is a good thing because
there are academics that have taken this as a very serious policy position.
oh yeah, and they're hardlining committed to it, and they're willing to sacrifice some things that we have upheld as sacred for generations.
It's
and
the
they
policy
are willing,
of the United Nations. It's the policy of the World Health Organization.
Yeah.
It's the policy of Barack Obama.
Yes, and there's people that still believe, especially here in California, that Barack Obama was a wonderful, inspiring president, and they take what he says as gospel. But I think we need to really ask ourselves why people are willing to throw away the basic constructs of humanity and individual liberty and sovereign agency.
Yes.
They're willing to throw that away for this false sense of safety and turning
Yes.
over
Security.
turning over our liberties in exchange for security and the ability to live an existence without property, but with access to services. And, I think going to this foundationally gets us out of the hyperbole of the divisions, these artificial divisions that are separating us from having real intellectual conversations around this. And I think that to disarm ourselves as dissidents, like I'm not a dissident. You are not a dissident. The fact that we have been
Jay
labeled...
Bhattacharya is not a dissident.
Jay Bhattacharya is not a dissident. The last thing I want to be in life is a dissident. I have intentionally chosen careers to not go into politics. Being
And
a
yet here
patent
you are.
attorney is about as far from politics and dissidents and revolutions. I'm not a revolutionary. What I am is somebody that loves humanity and who loves freedom.
Thank you.
And so this is the part that we've got to return to a semblance of sanity in this world.
Or not. Okay, you're making some fundamental assumptions about human nature. And that, for me, has been one of the most profound disappointments.
We can't bring them back
is
to the
that
table?
I don't know that we can or can't. The challenge is it's long been known. There's an interview from Aldous Huxley in the early 60s in black and white that's fascinating, where he basically provides justification for propaganda this is Brave New World author, and makes the point that about 20% of the population is very resistant to hypnosis or propaganda. 20% is extremely susceptible, and the remaining 60% is kind of on a spectrum in between the two, vacillates, largely depending on how they see the overall culture going, the kind of which way the wind's blowing. And he makes the case this is good, that 20% that will readily accept government propaganda and storylines is necessary in order to have a functional state. And also having the 20% of dissidents that won't believe anything and want to understand everything personally based on data is a good thing also, and it's all adaptive. But the change between 62 given and the present is the rise of this incredible power of modern psychology and things like neurolinguistic programming that are at the core of the thesis of the book, which is PsyWar. Psychological warfare. And the United States government, together with Great Britain and the Five Eyes Alliance, has developed psychological warfare to a high level, largely in the context of the various insurgencies that they've encountered having to do with Al-Qaeda and the Middle East and those disruptions, which I argue, I don't think we've ever won a fourth generation war. Going back to Vietnam and before, we're just not, bringing out the big guns and tanks don't work when you have these insurgency movements that capture the minds of people, and so the West has developed this suite of technologies to manipulate people's opinion that is called psychological warfare, and largely had that directed against foreign adversaries. Developed it to a high level, and then inexplicably decided in the face of the threats of Brexit and UKIP and Donald Trump that it was going to be necessary to deploy this technology against citizens, and in order to preserve democracy. And maintain the geopolitical balance that they have worked so hard to craft. And I argue that when this is done, the power of the tech is so great when it's combined with modern
tools,
digital
technologies
tools,
specifically,
that everything they're able to control all information, everything that you think, believe, feel, and when that happens, when a government is willing to deploy that tech against their own citizenry, the concept of individual sovereignty becomes completely obsolete because nobody can resist this. This tech goes straight into your lizard brain. And it is incredibly effective and powerful. Matter of fact, interestingly enough, the highly educated are among the most susceptible.
Mm-hmm.
Because we've all been trained, those of us that have been through the system, as you and I have been trained to be obedient, to defer to authority, and all of these skills that we've had to develop in order to succeed in a modern technological space.
We see the world in terms of these taxonomies, and we see information in an outline structure with heading and subheadings, and
particularly
then
anybody that comes out of the programming world,
right? And, well, or anyone who has spent time in obtaining professional degrees and working up in a world where there's necessary hierarchy, and you get advanced based on your ability to regurgitate what you've been taught.
And assimilate it and to comply with it.
But again, here we are, and what breaks that psychology is when you follow that exact same method, the same scientific method of learning and educating oneself, and then you see a break. And this is where I want people to be able to find hope, is that when you use that same methodology to test the narrative that we're being fed right now, it breaks down. That narrative breaks down. This globalist agenda actually makes no logical sense.
You see a discontinuity in the matrix.
Yes.
And then suddenly you go, oh, what's that?
What is that? And then you can see the really bad actors, and the bad actors begin to really stand out. And they stand out because you can see where their conflicts of interest lies, and which is why I think lawyers in particular have been particularly successful in overcoming some of these narratives, because they can use legal theory to show that the law and the facts are no longer in alignment, and that those arguments that are being fed to us from the media and from these bad actors goes against the theory of our legal system. It's our last defense.
Except, and this is jumping into Supreme Court decisions recently. So another one of the pathways that I've had to tread is to try to understand legal, and I'm not a lawyer, but about a year and a half ago, I began to appreciate the meaning of the Chevron deference decision, which is what's underpinned the power of the administrative state. Mm-hmm. And the problem that all these court cases have run into again and again and again, and I've been an expert witness in some, is that Chevron deference, this fundamental Supreme Court case that happened over a decade ago, it was a very marginal decision, established that the administrative branches of the executive branch and their scientific infrastructure are by default defined as the experts by the courts, because the courts don't have the expertise to judge science. It's been the position. Mm-hmm. And so if the CDC or the FDA or USDA or FCC or EPA says
they call in
experts,
witnesses.
But again and again and again, mm-hmm. It's extremely difficult to overcome the expert positions that have been put out by these administrative agencies, and until now, like last week, mm-hmm. When Chevron deference got overturned, mm-hmm. and that is a huge game changer.
It's massively important, especially in an environment in which our agencies have been so corrupted and captured by corporates. And when you have an executive branch, as you well note in your book, that is acting on behalf of a international organization, not on behalf of
organizations. It's not necessarily just one, but reflecting a globalist mindset.
That was not elected. These individuals
Yeah.
were not elected by us and now are representing our interests
Yeah.
here in our homeland.
Or they're representing someone's interests. I'm not sure who. And as pointed out by Klaus Schwab himself, their Young Leaders program has trained people that have been intentionally placed into government and influential industry positions. So he uses the term, we have infiltrated governments intentionally.
Well, we have 5 minutes, and I feel like we could keep talking for another 6 hours because we haven't even gotten into. I mean, I'd love to do another podcast and talk about how we combat this, because we know. I
Thank
think
you.
right now we are defining what it is we're up against, and we're all just trying
Yeah.
to figure out the multitude of ways that this agenda is at play in our lives, and we're all dealing with it from our back foot because now we've been labeled dissidents. And the thing is I have to believe that there's a way to counteract the programming because there's something so fundamental in humans still that can be accessed. The chips have not been implanted in the brains
Yet.
They're starting.
Thanks, Elon.
Right. Children are not being born in artificial wombs yet, but the preconditions are all set for this to now happen. Preconditions related to, renting the womb of other women, right?
Yeah.
So this detachment from the biological
15-minute cities,
process.
et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly. I just found out that the state of California wants to cut 40% of water off to farmers, which means that we will lose 40% of our food supply in this state, or the outdoor grown food supply.
It's not just this food supply. California feeds much of the West.
It's a breadbasket of the United States. So we are on the precipice of all of this. We are starting to find each other. We being, we need to call ourselves something other than dissidents. I think we want to be physical humans. We want to preserve the beauty and bounty of nature. We want to preserve the beauty and bounty of what it means to be truly, deeply connected as a human, unreliant on outside forces to exist. We want agency of our humanity.
Yes.
And so we'll find a short brand name for what we might call that, but it's you call it physical humans, the physical.
That was
human.
one term, yeah.
But there's other ways to think about it, and I think that there's this embodiment. We are spirit embodied, and that allows us to function with an independent. In independence and with liberty as we connect to our natural environment without intervention. So there's a way for us, I think, to reconcile all of this right now and find tools and arguments that state, we want to have a say in when our sun gets blocked out by cloud seeding. That's a big
More
one.
than want. It is a fundamental right.
It's a fundamental right. Going back to fundamental rights is where we're going to find our ability to fight from our front foot.
Uh-huh.
And I think that I'd love to reconvene with you and maybe a few others and record a path towards protecting these fundamental rights and making the argument for why they're important, why people should want them. It is a very hard conversation I'm having with my peers, even trying to convince them that naturally bearing children is a wonderful, beautiful thing, and that it's for your child, if you're capable of it, it's the right thing to offer your offspring is a natural life. It's a really hard argument to make, though, in the face of this other narrative that artificial wombs are just these wonderful acts of convenience, and how humane for a woman to not have to go through childbirth.
Yeah, that argument is fundamentally naive biologically. It's the hubris behind the transhuman agenda is profound. It's the same hubris that underlies the belief that we can control nature and our environment because we fully it's this hubris of the modeler which is driving a lot of this not only the transhuman agenda but the globalist agenda. The idea that if we only had sufficient data on all of the independent agents, remember, because this agency-based modeling is what we're talking about. You appreciate what I'm talking about. If we only had enough data points, then we could accurately model and predict a better world, and to design this under utilitarian principles,
Mm-hmm.
and to apply the neo-Malthusianism that human species will destroy the world, and so therefore, and exhaust the natural resources, and therefore we need to modify human behavior, reproduction, etc., in order to align with the modeled-based predictions of carrying capacity,
Mm-hmm.
etc., etc. It's all built on the thesis that we have enough comprehension about the nature of the world and the nature of biology and the nature of ecology to be able to become the masters of the universe. Or as Yuval Harari likes to say, we become gods. God is obsolete. We are now gods. That's the core underlying thesis behind transhumanism explicitly. That's not me making something up. That's not a conspiracy theory. You read his work. That's the core thesis. And that is the underpinning of modern globalism, really. So what I'm hearing you say is the idea that we might convene a salon of free thinkers to wrestle with these bigger issues. Amen. Great idea.
Well, and there must be a fundamental pitfall and flaw in a human becoming a god. Because wouldn't that mean the end of humanity as we know it?
The thesis is that's a good thing. Okay,
Their thesis
the
is, yeah.
underlying thesis of transhumanism is that the human species is obsolete, and the new human man-machine fusion merging towards a robotic human entity is the new species that will allow this greater consciousness to expand and explore the universe and populate the universe. That's the underlying. There's a book that didn't get a lot of play, Dark Aeon, that really dives into this, and you've lived it because you have been in the belly of the beast, in the old garlic patch of Gilroy that we now call Silicon Valley.
I'm living it every day. I'm fighting it every day.
Yeah,
And it's a very challenging psychological fight to wage day after day.
the psychology, that I think that's the key word here, is we're encountering the limits of humans and the weaknesses of human psychology and the knowledge of how to manipulate that for other purposes and other agendas. And if there's an underlying theme in this book and the other stuff behind all this, in my journey of what the heck is going on, I don't understand it. How can I make sense
Yeah.
of it? It's that this ability to psychologically manipulate humans is profound, and we don't recognize it. It's been surreptitiously deployed on us, and it's unethical, grossly unethical. I speak quite strongly about the deployment of psychological bioterrorism, and we're seeing that now yet again with H5N1. But beyond that, the wholesale manipulation of human thought, minds, emotions through deployment of this technology to advance other agendas, many of which are not open and transparent, and few, if any, have had the chance to debate, endorse, or otherwise.
Make a case for humanity.
Yeah, it's verboten, and a large fraction of the population doesn't care.
I don't know that they know what caring means in this moment. I don't know that it means that they understand the risks they're taking. And I say that because when I challenge individuals on this, they pose themselves as being of a lineage and legacy that will be spared.
Aha!
They do. They really think that their
Right.
children will be spared
Right.
of a vaccine injury, and that their children will be spared of infertility, that their children will be spared of losing access to their food source and their water.
This is an analogy that comes to mind is the coder who believes that artificial intelligence is a great thing and doesn't realize that it is rapidly making him completely obsolete.
Is it the hope that these individuals will somehow reach demigodery themselves?
That's a case that's made that to just take a whipping horse. Bill Gates has the resources and perhaps will be first in line to upload his entire consciousness onto Web 4 synthetic reality, and he will live forever. I really think a lot of this is about immortality.
Of course it is.
This is about these underlying fundamental human themes that the Greeks examined.
Yeah.
This is big picture threads, and going back to this little nasty Rolling Stone hit piece. Rolling Stone, what happened there?
They got bought.
Yeah, exactly, and transformed to something else, wolf in sheep's clothing. But this smear on you, part of the wrap-up smear, that you are not only QAnon, but you're allied with these Christian nationalists and others that are speaking about these fundamental issues of what is the nature of human and what is the proper way to live one's life, and what are the ethics underlying this, and what is the role, is there a higher calling, a higher reality? Is there a higher being? Is there a higher consciousness? What's bizarre about all of this is you would think that for myself and my wife, coming from Central Coast Californian culture, is we like to say, it's the hippy dippy type of holistic yoga people, that part of your stereotype, that are the defenders of this new narrative so often. That must be talk about cognitive dissonance. That must be the world that you're encountering all the time, is because you're very much of that progressive Californian culture, and yet you have awakened.
Right. Well, I think what I've awakened to is that to be human is to be fully human. You can't actually shortcut bits of it.
Thank you.
And that is what I've woken to. And that's just part of having had the opportunity to live a full human experience, which I think for people is to become a parent, to bear children. I think that's the piece that I've learned is the fundamental connection to our humanness, is the connection to pure, strict, natural access to growing a family, to having agency over your life as a parent and your child's life as your child. And it is the thing that I think is going to bring people back to understanding who they are as human, why it's precious, and why it's worthy of protecting, and why it's worthy of rejecting a transhumanist agenda, because no one is spared under that agenda.
Yeah, that's deep. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you for coming out today. That was hopefully just part one of a series.
It would be my pleasure. Honor. And let me just say thank you for the courage to take this journey. And I know for those that haven't experienced it, we can say all these pretty words about sticks and stones will break your bones, but words can never hurt me. But Uh, these attacks are deeply painful to me, and I think anybody that's subjected to it. And um, there's a fundamental disrespect for the individual in these people that are willing to behave in this way, and yet, it's very effective at getting people to back off and shut up. And folks that are out at the forefront that are subjected to this receive the type of attacks they do because they're being used as an example to try to dissuade others. And
Mm-hmm.
you have two options. You can shut up and go away, which is what they want, or you can say, hell no, I'm going to stand up, and I'm going to speak my truth and try to do what I can to help others. That's a key part of being human. And you are doing that. And so I just want to acknowledge that leadership, acknowledge the pain that comes with it. But if it's of any help, when I travel, and I hope you're starting to experience this, I am surrounded by love. I was just at a conference in Italy of free thinkers that are creating a whole new medical system. And it was, all of the trolls and the haters and the attacks and everything cannot withstand all of the love that just surrounded me.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope you're experiencing that too. And I'm sure that if not yet, it will come soon.
Thank you very much. I have realized that at the basis of our fundamental right is to embody love. And that has been what I think we risk losing if we go the transhumanist route, is that it actually becomes harder to embody love because you are pre-programmed with so many other priorities.
Well said.